Welcome to the Refurbishment Mastery podcast with me, Martin Rapley. If you're a property investor who is worried about paying too much for your next property, concerned that you don't know how to manage a refurb, or scared that you will be ripped off by a builder, then this is for you. In this podcast, I share over 30 years of experience of managing refurbishments and conversions to help you make more profit, save your time, and ultimately enjoy the process. On with the podcast. So how do you know if you're going to get the best value for the property that you've created, whether you've refurbished a property or converted a property? How do you know that you are going to maximize the rent or maximize the selling price or indeed maximize the nightly rate if you've got a serviced accommodation model? I'm going to go through some real live experience that I've had. I have been looking for rental property over the last couple of weeks, and I'm going to explain to you some of the properties that we've been to see and why some of them, in my view, are not getting the maximum rent. They're not perhaps being rented as quickly as the owners might be expecting, and potentially I think some of them are probably going to be having ongoing issues as once the tenants are in, which is something that is, something we're aware of, and we want to ensure that if we rent a property, that we're not going to have a property that is going to continually be breaking. So I've got a few real life properties that we've been seeing. I'm not going to say where they are or the details or anything more than that, but just some things that we can all learn from as far as how we can, in most cases, not do these things and therefore get a much better value out of our properties at the end of the day. So one of the first properties we went to see was a bit of a quirky house. It would have been built as one big house in its day, and it had been split up into two smaller houses. I'm not entirely sure it was split the best way, but I didn't really look at that in too much detail. There was a really odd thing where the garden had been split in half. So it was quite a long, skinny garden, but the neighbours' access, the other half of the house, the access to their part of the garden was actually past two windows looking into the living room of the property we were looking at. So you would either want to keep the blinds down, or you perhaps want to consider some obscuring in the glass. So yeah, a bit of an odd thing, but this was certainly a very old conversion. But again, something that you can definitely avoid when you're doing your own planning. You can think about how these things work a little bit better. And it may well be that certainly one of these windows, I'm not even sure it was necessary. It was perhaps an existing window, and maybe they should have considered blocking it up. But that was one of the things. The first thing that struck me about this property was how, to some extent, just about everything was bodged. There was no doubt that every time any repair had been done on the property, it hadn't been done necessarily by a particularly good tradesman. I suspect that tradesman hadn't had the work signed off and approved. And I would think in a lot of cases, it had been done in the cheapest possible way that the work could be carried out. The kitchen was actually brand new. You could see it was brand new. It was the nicest part of the whole house. And yet I'm not entirely sure it had been installed by a carpenter. There is a chance that it was installed by the investor, the owner of the property themselves. It looked like a DIY installation. Some of the cuts weren't particularly good. The cupboard doors weren't leveled up properly. A couple of them were banging. The handles were loose. All just fairly fundamental things that a quality tradesman would just never do that. So I think, probably refurbished on the cheap or installed on the cheap, and it absolutely showed. That, I think, also calls me to looking a little bit closer at other things. And things like the silicone in the shower wasn't a good finish. The grouting, to be fair, they might have been planning to clean the grouting up a little bit, but that didn't look particularly good to me either. The whole house was painted white. Everything was white. So it had no features to it. It had no style to it. Um, there were no curtain poles up, no blinds, and quite how they were expecting, those to be installed. Because typically, in my experience, most ASTs have actually got a clause saying that you can't cut holes in the walls, you can't make holes in the walls, you can't put fixings in the walls. So that hadn't been considered. On my own personal portfolio, we always provide blinds or curtains, depending on the styling and the windows and things like that. But every one of our properties have got curtains in them, whether they're single let flats or whether they are HMOs. We always put curtains up, and of course the curtain poles. That means they're fitted properly. They're the right size, the right shape, and everything like that. By the way, we also put picture hooks in all of our properties so that the tenants can come in and actually hang pictures up, make it their own. We'll leave light shades in all of our properties, so we will put things in that just make it a home almost straight away. This particular property, was full of bodged and cheap repairs. I think it just absolutely showed. And my concern was that whilst it looked as though quite a bit of it probably had been painted, and of course with white you can't tell what's new and what's old, my concern was that there were some other bodged repairs that had been painted over. Perhaps there was even some condensation mould. Perhaps there was some damp that had just been painted over. And of course, if we're a tenant and living in there for the next 12 months, maybe 18 months or so, and we're only looking to rent so that we can find an ideal next house and not be in the competition. That's the only reason we're planning on renting for the short term. But my concern would be what's been covered over, and is this all going to come to light whilst we're tenants there? Are we going to find that the damp has just been painted over and it's all going to come through in the next few months? And realistically, what is going to break whilst we're going to be there? And if it does break, is it going to break? Are we going to be blamed for breaking it, whereas actually it was a bodge job in the first place? Or is it going to be broke? Does it get broken and then someone comes along and bodges the repair? And ultimately, it just didn't feel good at all. So in that respect, think about the work you're doing to the properties. You may save a little bit of money getting the cheap tradesman in to do the work, but I suspect it will lower the quality of your tenants. It will almost certainly lower the rent. It will mean that the property could potentially sit empty for a longer period, and ultimately, the repairs are never done properly. So it's just a continual cycle. We've done a cheap repair this month, but in 2 months' time, we've got to do another cheap repair and another cheap repair 2 months later, and another one 2 months after that. Spend some money, do the repairs properly, and you won't have to touch it for another 5 years, and you will get that back in the longer term. So that was the first property we went to see. Actually, the very first property we went to see in our little spell of viewing properties. Now, then at the other end of the extreme, we also looked at a property that was actually a new build house, almost certainly being built by a small developer. According to the agent, they had bought the house next door and got planning permission to build an attached house onto it. So it actually made it a terrace of 3. So they bought one of a semi-detached pair, and then they'd got permission to build a new house on the end. From the street, it looked really nice. The house on the end was in keeping with the rest of the street. They'd managed to get a driveway to it. So first impressions were really, really good. Now, the learning here was that I don't believe the developer had for 1 minute considered whether they were delivering the best possible house that they could do. I think they had very much taken a basic scheme from an architect, possibly a scheme that an architect did to get planning to demonstrate that there was scope for a house in this location, But there was no real further thought about whether this house was the best possible house that could be delivered. And it wouldn't have cost any more money to think about the layout in a better way and provide a better house. It had been built as a three-bedroom house. It had it was a three-story house. The third bedroom was up in the roof. The third bedroom was not really a bedroom. It was a quirky shape. The staircase came up in the middle of the room, so it kind of made the room a U shape. There was no door at the top of the stairs. The door was at the bottom of the stairs. A door is needed for fire regulation, so that's no surprise. But I don't think the staircase had been thought out. It was almost as though the staircase was too grand for the house, and they'd done a staircase that turned round on itself. And I think it took up too much space. So the top floor bedroom was not particularly usable. It would have made a nice office space up there, possibly a playroom. A single bed would have fitted up there, but I don't think you'd have got a double up there because it was an odd shape. So that was one observation that we had there. The two bedrooms on the middle floor, there was also a bathroom on the middle floor. All in all, that all kind of worked. On the lower floor, there was a funny sized living room at the front. And then there was a funny sized kitchen and a funny sized dining area at the back. And I say funny, the lounge was just a little bit too small to be a lounge. Kitchen was a little bit too big. It had an enormous bar counter in it that really wasn't necessary. The area behind that was the dining room was probably it was too big to be a dining room, but it wasn't again quite big enough to be a living room. The kitchen had far too many cupboards in it, but none of those cupboards were usable. None of that space was overly usable. It's hard to describe what they've done, but they put a slim line of cupboards behind the door. So it had a worktop on the top, but the cupboards were they were wall units sat on the floor. So they weren't overly usable. They didn't add a lot of value. This was a three-bedroom family house, by the way, really. The kitchen didn't have a dishwasher in it. It didn't really even have a cupboard that could be taken out and a dishwasher installed because of the way it had been laid out. It had an integrated washing machine. It had an integrated fridge. It didn't have a freezer, and there was no space for the freezer. You'd have to put that in the dining room end. But because of the way this bar counter fitted in there, to get to the freezer, you'd have been walking around the bar counter all the time. So not the best layout in there. And then you've got the lounge at the front of the property, and then this dining room that actually had nice bifold doors out into the dining area, but it all just felt a little bit odd. The first thing we thought was, well, why odd-shaped lounge in the front? Why wasn't that done as the kitchen? And then we'd have had a nice long lounge diner at the back, looking out into the garden. So putting the kitchen in the front would not have cost any more money, but it would have been a much nicer room, much nicer use of the space at the back. The final straw with this particular property was looking at there was a cloakroom on the ground floor. It was underneath the stairs. There was no way I could have stood and used that toilet under the stairs. It was a box. The slope of the stairs made it impossible. They hadn't even taken the time to finish off the soffit, the underside of the stairs. So the ceiling of this space was actually the shape of the stairs. So all in all, not well presented. Another property that was totally painted out in white, had no style, no features to it. Oh, it didn't actually have any built-in cupboards at all, which is a little bit odd because I think the planning regulations say that you should have built-in cupboards, but it didn't have any built-in cupboards. There was no space whatsoever in the hall to hang any coats. I don't know where you'd have hung your coats. Probably in your living room. That was probably the obvious place, which would have been nicer if perhaps that was your kitchen and there was a cupboard in there. But all in all, not well thought out. So if you're delivering a property, think about the flow, think about the layout, and I'll come back to this later on. Think about how it actually gets used. So another property that we went to see. This was a flat, a two-bedroom flat. This one, the kitchen was very small. It had no worktop. The way they designed it, it had 300. If it was an L-shaped kitchen, if I describe from the left hand going round, it had a 300 millimeter wide worktop, then a kitchen and a draining board. Then it had another 300 millimeter worktop and the corner bit that wrapped round. So, and then there was another 300 millimeters, well, probably less than that, probably only 100 millimeters to the hob. So, it was the biggest bit of counter there to do any preparation. You'd had to have stood in the corner and you would have used the corner of the kitchen. Then there was a hob, and I'll tell you about the hob in a bit. And then the other side of the hob, there was about another 200 millimeters of worktop. And then there was a fridge space for a fridge freezer. So, all in all, I don't know. There was the corner bit that would have been 600 by 600. And then there was a few other bits. There was barely more than 1 meter of worktop in that kitchen. It was, yeah, not good at all. What hadn't helped was somewhere in the past, the 600 millimeter wide hob had been taken out and replaced with a 900 millimeter hob. So this tiny little kitchen now had a 5 burner hob in it, except you had nowhere to do any cooking. By the time you'd have put a microwave, an air fryer, a toaster, and a kettle on the worktop, there was no space whatsoever to do any preparation in there. So very badly thought out. This would have been a developer, although the wide hob was definitely put in later. How do I know the wide hob was put in later? Because the extract hood above it was still only 600 millimeters wide. And there's no way a developer would have put a 900 millimeter hob in there. So, again, why was the 900 hob put in there? Was it cheap? Was it picked up cheap and someone just went and put it in? No one's managed, no one's checked what's gone in there. I don't know. The odd little thing was in this particular property, the living room had this odd little alcove on the side. And there was no real reason for this alcove. And yet the alcove could have so easily been incorporated into the kitchen, giving us probably at least another meter of countertop, but probably also allowing the fridge freezer to be relocated and therefore another 600 at the other end, which actually would have made it a really nice kitchen. And again, someone's designed this and no one has asked questions. No one's looked and said, is this actually right? Does this serve the purpose? Have we got the wall in the right place? And someone back in the day could have asked the question, and the structural engineer said, "Oh, well, that's the easiest place to put the wall because it needs to be a structural wall." What you need to be questioning is, yeah, okay, maybe that is the logical place to put the wall from a structural perspective. But what if we didn't put it there? What if we put it in the best location for the layout? Yes, it might add on, say, £1,000 because for whatever reason we've got to put more steel in there or something like that. But would you get more than £1,000 later on down the line when you come to sell the property, or indeed when you come to rent the property? In this particular property, it was part of a block of flats, so it would have been a developer that built it, and then a landlord or an investor has bought the property and is now renting it out. So there's crossover here about where we can learn and where we all fit into this. But is that something that you can avoid on your next refurbishment? Can you just ask the right questions to make sure that the kitchen is actually usable? And ask about odd alcoves. Why is the alcove there? Why do we need this? It was kind of a recess type area that I didn't think was really adding any value at all. So there's some learnings there. I went to a really nice property. It was kind of built as a penthouse style property. It was a single story flat again, and built on the top of a building, actually a building I knew back in the day as a pub, and really nice. Lots of glass, lots of light, nice space, nice kitchen, nicely presented, nicely decorated. We saw it with the tenants still living in there, but the tenants fortunately hadn't cluttered it up or anything, so it looked nice. It had a long balcony all the way down one side that actually joined up two bedrooms and the living room. So you could effectively walk in and out of all of the bedrooms or all of the rooms through this one balcony. And then it had this tiny little Juliet balcony on the other side of the living room. So the living room actually had a Juliet balcony on one side, a balcony on the opposite side, and it actually then had some windows on the third side. So hence loads of light. Really, really impressive when you first looked at it. And then we started looking at the logistics of it and realised that there was not one single opening window in this property. They were all opening doors. So it's one thing saying the property hasn't got any opening windows, we've got air conditioning built in as a result, and there's a lot of properties like that, particularly high-rise blocks of flats. But it's a very different thing to say, oh yeah, there's no air conditioning, you can have ventilation, but you've got to open a door to get ventilation. That's lovely in the summer. Throw open your doors, lots of light, lots of air coming in off the balcony, but not so good in the winter or the spring and autumn where you want a bit of air, but you don't want a whole 2.5 meter high door opened to get air into the property. And what happens if you go out? You can't leave any ventilation in your property at all because you've got a possible security issue. Probably not in this one because it was up on the top level, but you've certainly got issues with rain coming in. What if it started raining whilst you were out and the rain was driving in? You'd have rain coming into the property. What if you wanted to leave some air coming through the property at night? How would you deal with that if it started raining in the middle of the night? So just some logistical issues here that for me would put me off. So think about this when you're doing your properties. I personally am not excited by properties where there are big windows and you can only have one window open or closed. I do like small fan lights where you can leave them open a lot. If you're renting your properties out, you want to be encouraging the tenants to open their windows and getting ventilation and getting air around the property. So having big windows isn't a good thing, particularly also perhaps from a security perspective. But doors, that's even worse, really. And so the person who owned this property and was renting it out, again, probably bought from a developer, and possibly never lived in, or perhaps they didn't even realise what the problems were. Got an issue where potentially they're renting a flat out where it's not easy to ventilate. If you do ventilate it, you run the risk of rain coming in. It had wooden floors. So rain comes in, stains the wooden floors. Who's responsible for that? Is that the tenant because they've not maintained the property well enough? So if you're delivering properties like this, could this just reflect in the rent? Could it reflect in the churn? Could it reflect in the time it takes to rent? Things, just the seeds that I'm sowing for you to think about. And then the last property I want to talk to you about was, again, back to a house, a traditional Victorian type house, not the best quality at all. Lots of similar issues from the previous one. But something that I just wanted to flag up on this one was it was marketed as having a loft room. So it was a two-story house being built as two bedrooms upstairs, two living rooms and a kitchen downstairs, but also had a loft room. Now, it wasn't a proper room because it didn't have a staircase to get up there. It had a proper loft hatch and a ladder to get to it. But once you got up there, it was a fully boarded floor and it had an element of insulation and boarding on the roof as well, and a Velux roof light up there. I suspect it wouldn't have been brilliant. I suspect it would have been quite cold in the winter and probably too hot in the summer. But it was an accessible space that was, could have been used as more than just an attic space. So we knew that when we went to see it. We were thinking it was only ever storage for us. But the real bonkers thing about the whole thing, though, was that the loft access was in the master bedroom. Well, that in itself is okay, except the ladder came down into the only place in the bedroom where the bed would go. So once you put a bed in this bedroom, you couldn't get your loft ladder down. So now the only bed you could get in this bedroom was actually a single bed. So we've got a master bedroom that we can't put a double bed in. We can only put a single bed because the loft ladder comes down in the wrong place. Had they turned the whole loft access round 90 degrees, the loft ladder would have come down on the side of the bedroom rather than slap bang into the middle of the bedroom, and made it far, far more usable. You could have put a cabinet underneath it and it would have come down over the top of the cabinet. Why was it put this way round? I suspect that was the cheap way to put it in without cutting too many joists up in the roof space to make it fit in. I suspect it was a cheap thing. I suspect, again, that the person who put it in wasn't overly well managed, and there was no thought behind the whole thing. So there's some examples there of some things that I've seen over the last few weeks that will hopefully help you get a better value from your properties at the end of the day. Some things to think about just in summary. Think your schemes through. Imagine being the tenant, the buyer, the guest. What would they expect when they live there or when they use the property? When they come home from work, where do they expect to hang their coat? Where are they going to put their keys? When they're watching the TV, which is the nice view? Where might they sit so that when they're watching TV, there's also a nice view out of the window as well? When they're in their bedroom, where is the nice place for, what's the nicer view from the bed? And how do things lay out? So do think about it. Put yourself in the mind's eye of your end user and just question what you're being told. When an architect presents you with a scheme, don't accept that that's the only scheme possible. Ask good questions and consider the value of doing different things. Talk through and show your schemes to other people. Share it with other developers, with other property investors, and you're welcome to share it with me, of course, and just get other people's feedback and ideas, and just think through and get their, as I say, get their different ideas. You might find that one tiny little change adds some massive value to your property. And if I can leave you with just one final thing to take on board, and that is that sometimes spending a little bit more can lead to a huge amount more value. And the mindset of I've got to do everything on the cheap, and I'm not saying that's how you're thinking, but I know a lot of property investors are thinking we've got to do it cheap, we've got to deliver it cheaply, we've got to repair it cheaply, we've got to maintain it cheaply. I guarantee that will backfire. Spend a little bit more and ultimately you will get more value for it. But do your comparisons, do your analysis, and do your research to understand what you need to do to ensure that you are absolutely maximizing your value. I really hope that there's some food for thought there when you're putting your next scheme together.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. Please do like, share, and leave a comment where you can. If you need any guidance or advice with anything to do with your refurbishments or conversions, then don't hesitate to reach out. You can book a free call with me by clicking on the link at the top of my website, refurbishmentmastery.com. There's other ways you can contact me in the show notes as well. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.